ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Hey there, this is Matt Petrowski for ISO FileMaker Magazine, and in this video what we're going to be taking a look at is a little bit of a UI revision. There was a file that I used for a previous video and I made some changes in order to make it easier for myself. Let's talk about some things that you can do to make things easier for your users as well. Okay, so thank you for joining me here on my desktop. What we have over here is I've got two files, and we're going to be looking at the transition that I made from the original file to the next file. But along the way, we're going to talk a lot about different things that you can do in order to make your FileMaker solutions more usable. Now, I love FileMaker. This is one of my most favorite topics, is basically being able to do whatever kind of UI you want. There's really no constraints because on a pixel by pixel level, you get to put anything you want anywhere, and that is very empowering. It's one of FileMaker's primary strengths. Hopefully they know it, and we can take advantage of it for years to come. So this is the file that I've just switched to. This was the file that I started with. And the first thing we're going to do is we will talk about what your options are. I chose to go with this option, and that is having this sidebar on the side. A lot of the times this is called a master detail. Now, what I'm going to be covering in this video is how I made the highlight work with regards to conditional formatting, how I actually use button bars with regards to getting this text to scale off all the way off to the side. If you don't know, it's a real simple drag, but we're going to talk about containment and other objects because there are some things in this file that are done that with regards to lifetime maintenance, you need to be aware of that I did in this file. And I'm going to be talking about that in this video as well. Also, there are some really cool little tricks. You can see that as I highlight right here, what we're looking at, that edge of the sidebar. Now that is done with a gradient, but just that one little trick makes your UI just so much more comfortable in terms of the accessibility or the presentability of that, and I'm going to be briefly talking about that as well. Beyond that, we'll be talking a little bit about the grid and the other tricks that I've done in order to take this file from this plain file to this file. Now, before we do that, let's talk about what your options are here in FileMaker. So you find yourself asking the question, where should you host your FileMaker solution? Well, one of those dots right there. That's what I would pick. Now, they didn't come to me. I went to them, and I trust fmcloud.fm with all of my data. They are using the latest tech. In fact, did you know Claris is actually in some instances releasing features first and only for Linux? What does fmcloud.fm use? They use Linux. On top of that, they use containerization. And if you've not heard about containerization, then you will be. It's one of the best ways to host your FileMaker solution. I highly suggest that you check out fmcloud.fm. Okay, so what are your options for presenting data in FileMaker? Well, first we need to be familiar with what FileMaker provides us with in terms of our views. Now, if you're an old school FileMaker developer, then you're probably familiar with the three primary views, and those include form, this one list, and then this one table. Now, admittedly, table was added a little bit later in the history of FileMaker, and going all the way back to, I believe, the very beginning of FileMaker. Well, once it got a UI, it has always had form view and list view. Now, within form view, it's critical that you can make as many different lists as you want using portals, or modern day development might use web viewers. But FileMaker's native list view is extremely empowering as well. Table view is probably used a little less. That was implemented at a time where I believe there was this notion of Excel is too predominant, but how do we get Excel users to use FileMaker? Let's make FileMaker a little bit like Excel. Now, in this situation, what we can see is these grayed out options. If you're not familiar, I'll go into layout mode and we will go up to the layouts and we will go to the layout setup right there. When we are in this, one of the things that's really nice to know is if you create brand new layouts in FileMaker, those layouts may come with all default options turned on. And I'm talking about the views. That's the second tab that we have right here. Now, this is a very good thing to do when you're designing, is to limit the view to what is only possible. And there are some really creative things that you can do in FileMaker and take advantage of being able to switch between the two. There are a lot of little tips and tricks over the years. I've covered them on the FileMaker magazine website. For example, sub-summary parts only show when the database is sorted, but you can do a little trick where you sort on a I call it a non-intentional field, but you basically sort on something that the user would never sort, just in order to make a sub-summary part appear or go away by unsorting it or sorting it by something different. But essentially what you're going to do is, if you find all of these options right here, and I have no idea why that must be a change that FileMaker made. It used to be that you would click the table view and you would have to click on properties in order to get this window up, but working here in FileMaker 21, I guess somebody decided to make the option that when you click the checkbox, it now brings up the table view properties by default. Interesting. Don't know if that's documented, but just discovered it. But essentially, any view that you're creating, you want to limit that view. For example, the view that we have here is a form versus a list view. And of course, we can limit it just to the form view and make sure that that is the default view setting right there. So unless you're going to switch between the two, between form view and list view, I always make that suggestion that you do that. Otherwise, what happens is, let's go ahead and bring that back up. I've got a shortcut key assigned to it. Let's turn everything on. We'll say OK. By the way, I have a wonderful video talking about table view on the using it for as a developer on the magazine website. But when we go into browse mode, we're going to see that all of these options here are now available. I can switch this between list view, form view, or table view, list view, and form view. Now, obviously, the intent here was table view. So let's talk about what the objective was. This particular database had 45 records, and they were all examples. What I didn't like is I didn't like that I wasn't able to choose from my options, hence my addition of the sidebar on the side, which we're going to be covering. Now, the options here is we have to think about our UI from the standpoint of what is the user doing? Do they need to be able to navigate easily, or do they need to focus on the information that they're looking at right here? If that was the case, here are just a few of our options of how to promote that. If I needed this particular UI to have the user focus on this, then I might be more inclined to use what would be called a hamburger menu. And right where we see the highlight right there, it's usually the three little lines, or you can even put the word menu. And when you put that menu, option number 1 for the menu would be you can bring up a card window, and that card window can be fixed into this area where a sidebar would be. That's something that allows the user to focus on form view. You present the information, they work on that, but they can access the menu. You can set up a shortcut key, what have you. Another option with that is you can also have the same hamburger menu, but not bring up a card window, which is more modern in what I would probably suggest, but you can use a slider panel. So a slider panel, if you don't know, we go into layout mode, we look at our panels right here, we select on this and hold, we've got slide control, we can select on that. I'm just going to create a little one here. FileMaker tends to always default with 3 of something, button bar, tab panel, whatever, they give you 3. So you would get rid of 2 of those, or excuse me, you would have 2 of them. You would turn off show navigation, and you would disable swipe and gestures. You would take the time to set this to be transparent, more or less. And then what you can do is you can have that be over on the side. And initially, this is going to represent our sidebar, and it would be transparent. And initially, there's nothing going on, but a user would click the button right here, and that button then moves to the pane where the actual panel is. And this allows you to keep everything on the same layout without managing a separate layout, which would be a card window if you were going to use that method to bring that up. Now, our third option is a very old school but very viable, and that is just simply switching between a list view and a form view. We can, via a menu again, simply select and have that switch from one layout into another layout where you have two different designs. Now, herein lies yet another option. Let's call this option number 4, and I have done this with success. It is possible to actually divide up your layout. In this particular case, our layout has the body part right here. But it is absolutely possible to use a body part and then let's say some other part. Right now we have the top navigation. I'll double click to bring up the part definitions, but I have done this as well. It is possible to use a title header or a header or a leading grand summary. Anything that appears before the body can be used for the purpose of displaying content. And while you're in list view, many of these will show as well as the body, but when you go into form view, some of them, you get these effects where you can take advantage if you start to think of these not necessarily as specific to what they were initially intended, which was for the purpose of printing. So back in the day when everything was paper and we were printing it, each of these parts had a role in terms of what's printed. For example, a title header only shows on the first page of a printed or now a PDF document. But with regards to UI and your use of these parts for the purpose of facilitating UI, this is simply just another part. In fact, the way that I think of it is this is part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. This is just a numerical listing of all of the possible parts. How can I use them for my UI when I'm designing for the screen versus how can I use them when I'm going to use them for the purpose of output? And that's a very creative way to think about what you're going to do here in FileMaker and taking advantage. It's where a lot of different techniques have come from. So now that I've talked about what your options are with regards to addressing this particular situation, in my case, I just wanted a simple master detail. And the easiest solution in that regard was simply to go into layout mode on the original, go up to the area right here, select on a portal, and just drag that portal out. Now, old school FileMaker developers like myself, they remember the days where you did not have a master detail where you would be able to select from the current table. This is, to me, it's still a new thing, but if you just recently got started with FileMaker, it's always been there. This is what allows you to show all records of whatever the current found set is. Now, this is a key thing to think about because there is an alternative old school way of actually putting a portal on the layout. It is possible to create a self-relationship, meaning the table that I am currently on, which in this case is called OData Examples, if I create a relationship, and I create that relationship as a, a Cartesian product, I believe is what it's called. It's the, well, let's go into the define database and take a look at it. Just go where you need to see it. So we've got OData Examples. A self-relationship would simply mean I take a copy of this particular table occurrence, basically an alias or a shortcut. Doesn't matter what the field, to be completely honest. If I drag the title together, if I did the number together, it really doesn't matter. When I double click this and choose this X, which is the Cartesian product of all can see all is how I think of it. I can't explain the mathematical aspect of this, but if I change this, you see that options go away, allow creation of related records, they go away. But in essence, what I would have now as an opportunity was rather than selecting the portal tool and actually clicking on and adding the default current table, which is a master detail, which shows all records of the current found set, I could choose my self-relationship. So now what happens is my sidebar can be controlled by me rather than FileMaker. In other words, there's a lot of different things I can do. I could use a global field. And if I used a global field where in another scenario, say I'm going to use execute SQL, and I want this sidebar area, what's going to be right here, to only show all records that are tagged with red. Well, I would be able to do an execute SQL or even a FileMaker find and just go retrieve some records, bring the keys back, put the keys into a sidebar, and then make sure that this sidebar portal only shows, for the purpose of navigation, the limited subset of records that I want to see. Or in this case, what's happening is if I was to use this portal using a self-join through a Cartesian product, means that this sidebar portal is always going to show all records no matter what. Now, that can be dangerous. If you have 10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50, users usually can't process any more than a small list of information. So you want to keep things pretty small, but it is absolutely possible using this self relationship that I just showed you on screen. So getting rid of that, what we're going to do is we are now going to jump into what are the choices that I made. And we're going to talk about an interesting little thing. You'll notice it down at the bottom here, this pink line. What is this pink line about? And that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so let's talk about technical debt. You've heard the term before, but you really don't start to understand its implications until you get down the road with a FileMaker solution and you find out that it has hundreds, maybe even thousands of scripts and hundreds or possibly thousands of layouts. This is when files start to get really big, really hard to manage. If you inherit something like that, you're using a tool like Base Elements, Inspector Pro, or FM Perception. Something that allows you to just make heads or tails of what's going on. Now, this technical debt that we experience, we want to think about it constantly when we're developing in FileMaker. So over here, what I'm going to show you is an example of something that happens or is a byproduct of FileMaker. So here we have a tab panel, and this tab panel that we're switching between the two, from the user perspective, what we're seeing is down here at the bottom, we are looking at these buttons. Now, these buttons in this file are currently, they have the disabled look to them, or the disabled effect. Now, this is basically graying out the text and making sure that it seems like it's not an active button. But we notice that when we're moving from one tab to another, the buttons are all there and they stay there. But this is not only technical debt, but this is also a bit of a growing or impending potential problem with regards to performance. And that is because on all of these objects, when we select them, which we will do right here, and I have switched into the object inspector. Maybe your database is on the fields, probably not on the add-ons. So in the objects, we're going to take a look. And what we can see as I bring this on screen is because we have two tabs, when I switch between the two tabs, we've made it look exactly like what the user expects, having the buttons all there. But from a technical standpoint, we have technical debt because you can see we've got reset example, reset, clear, clear, send, send, reset, reset, clear, clear, send, send. So not only is the one button duplicated once in order to have two of them for each of the three buttons, it is then duplicated, that whole group is then duplicated a second time just in order to facilitate the other second tab. Now, in order to address this, we can easily do this with FileMaker's grouping and handle this in what I love to do, which is give myself developer clues, or at least give a developer clues. And that's so that when I come back in, I've made this much easier for myself. So we're going to solve this problem over in this database. I'm going to show you how I did it. We go into layout mode, and what we have is we can see that the group does exist. It is right here. I did not take the time to optimize the buttons themselves. I believe this was a recently created file, and this is a very, I wouldn't call it a super old school method, but it is a viable method to overlay buttons on top of each other. So you have one that's at the base layer and then another one, and one button is going to hide and another one's going to show based on different conditions in terms of the UI. There are alternatives which we can use, which would be changing the text dynamically. I prefer to use a button bar in order to use its calculation ability and then use the text formatting functions to set the text to gray versus whatever. You can use conditional formatting, what have you. But in this case, we've got 2 reset examples because I didn't want to take the time to mess with or learn what the hide calculation was doing. But ultimately, our objective is to have this one button and this one button and this one button, and that's it. The 3 buttons that are going to be on our UI. Now, the problem that we're going to experience is that because this is a tab panel is a containment object, meaning any pane contains whatever you put inside of it. And if we took a look at the original file, what we would see is that these 3 buttons, as I select into the group, and then FileMaker shows me the highlight of them, these 3 buttons, which was actually 6 buttons, which we would like to whittle down to just the 3, were contained within the boundaries of the actual tab panel. Now, using FileMaker's layering, it's absolutely possible to have things be, in front of or behind other objects. If you have to have something behind an object, such as a tab panel, there are settings that we can use where we can make most of the tab panel transparent, meaning you can see through the tab panel to see what's behind in the background. That's not the case of what I've done right here, but is absolutely viable. And then within the tab panel, we can simply put a rectangle or anything else that is the color that we want it to be, or there are settings that we can control. And this applies to all of our containment objects: sliders, tab panels, popovers, and then portals as well. They all have individual controls. A portal in particular, for example, it has its own background, and each row has a background value, and it does it for different states as well, and we can take advantage of those when we're designing. But in this case, the simple solution, if you haven't figured out by staring at it and waiting for me saying, Matt, can you get to the point? I have used an object that I call a developer object. This developer object, I often make it a very strong or obvious color that has nothing to do with my UI, in this case, magenta. When we select on this and we select on the object and we go to the hide settings in our 4th area right here, we can see that it is set to hide object when 1, true, always. All developer objects are always hidden and they are simply used for a particular purpose. And in this case, the only purpose of this developer object is to create a group where that group extends outside of the containment boundaries of the object that I'm working with. The object I'm working with is a tab panel. I want to have objects that are in front of that top panel of that tab panel so that it shows across all panes, 1, 2, and 3. I can do that by simply saying I'm going to have an object that extends outside of those boundaries, but then I'm going to group the objects that I want inside of that. And you can see that came with a piece of text as well. So it allowed me to get rid of a second piece of text, and ultimately it would allow me to get down to just the 3 buttons with minimal calculations, and I'm not replicating those calculations across conditional formatting and the hide setting. And that is one of the things that I love doing. There are a number of other ways that I will use objects, but for the most part, that is usually what it is primarily, is making sure that I can work outside of the containment of whatever objects contain things. So let's move on to the next item, which is going to be the portal itself that I added and the things that I did there so that you understand that, and then we will wrap this video up. All right, so let's get into the portal, one of my most favorite of the containment objects because it provides you with so many different display options. Now, one of the things that I try to do is I try to constantly figure out how can I work with the smallest number of objects in order to achieve the maximum benefits with regards to presenting data. That typically for me comes in the form of a single button bar within a row of a portal. Without adding a lot of extra objects, that's ideally what I'm typically going to try to do. Now, if I need to add a button, then I will add a button in at the end. But I'll tell you what, if it's possible, I will do everything I can to work with this one object. So if, for example, I needed an icon in front of this, I'm going to do whatever I can in order to make that icon part of the calculation rather than adding, let's say, a field in this area right here, which is a container, or an extra button, which is going to then have my icon. Or what I'm going to do is this button bar, there are some tricks that you can do. If I do extend up into having two elements, it may be one that will be a button bar for the purpose of icons, and then this object right here will be just offset like that. So the icons would be right here, and then I've got my actual calculation. Now, the first thing you should be recognizing right off the bat when I hit undo here is that this object extends way outside of the boundary of the portal. This is a super common, should be a default go-to for you. And as I turn on the display data, it is a setting that we find in the view menu. We should always know about this under the show sample data. It allows us to continue to work in layout mode and be able to see what's actually going on or what will be going on without having to go into browse mode. So I've got a shortcut key set for that so I can toggle between them. I can see the core or the canonical canonical field name, and I can switch in to see what the data is actually being represented just with a quick shortcut key there. Now, what I've done here is I have dragged this all the way out. I won't belabor that point, but you can see it goes all the way out here. However far your longest data is, it doesn't really matter. You can even go beyond the boundary of the layout if you want. It really is no big deal. FileMaker doesn't care. All this is going to do is it is going to conveniently extend any text that is coming at this point and not going to wrap. Now, if you do want to wrap, there are times that you can do that, and since you're using a button bar, within the button bar setting, within the calculation for that setting, you can always do things where you are going to change the text size. And this is a super powerful technique to use all of FileMaker's text functions. So if I get in here and I start to type text, just type text, FileMaker will come up with all of your options of all of the, if you can style, add, remove, font, whatever. I have other videos on the magazine website where I have talked about this. There are only a few of them that I use super commonly, but changing the text size, changing the text color, and then adding a style, this is one of the things to do. Most of the time, my style for an object is plain because I always know that I can add the style of bold in order to get that effect. And most of the time on your screen, you're wanting more plain than you are bold. Bold is usually your accent in order to drive emphasis. So another thing that we can do other than dragging that out is if we know the text is going to go long, we can do this right here. This is an extra object, but it's only one extra object. And you can see that it and this you can't see because all the way over on the edge here, their little eye icon that normally shows right here is not actually visible to us, but I promise you it's got the same thing right here as this little eye icon. This is simply my gradient. And you can see right there, we'll just use what's on screen, the tooltip. FileMaker created when they added this master detail portal, they added a new function, which is the get active record number. If you're an old school FileMaker developer and you have not investigated, there is a distinction between get active record number and get record number. And I've talked about this in other videos as well. Whether you're using this within the context of portals and your relationship, it can get a little bit complex, but the critical functions to use are active record number, active portal row, and then also get nth record. If you use the get nth record and the active portal row when you're on portals, you can selectively hide and show things unless the row is actually selected, and all kinds of things. Look on the magazine website for articles about that. So this gradient right here is super simple. I don't know that I need to show you exactly what it is, but There you go. It's a gradient. All it does, it goes from 100% black to 0% black. That's it. And that is for the purpose of overlaying on the text, which just allows the text to fade out, and you get that really nice effect. Now, another thing that I'm doing here with regards to the UI is you have to make decisions. If you leave everything on your layout as the same black, there's no distinction in terms of what's important. So I'm always asking myself, what are the top 3 important things? And that top 3 important things question applies to the whole layout and then to all individual elements that are showing data, because it always cascades down in. So on this layout, I ask myself, what is the number 1 most important thing? Where am I? What am I looking at? What's the second most important thing? What's the information relative to what I'm looking at? Now, I didn't redesign this layout in the area. I just basically added the sidebar. And I might design this differently if it were up to me. But taking that 3 rule, what are the 3 most important things of what I'm looking at, going from the layout at large and then moving down to, okay, I'm now working with this portal. What are the 3 most important things of this portal? Number 1, where am I? That's where we get this highlight right here. I want to know what record I'm on. And sometimes I try not to duplicate things within the UI. You can see that this says O1 select all records. Well, up at the top, I have O1 select all records. Well, in many cases, you can do that as long as it doesn't cause confusion, because this area distinctly divided by this line right here within the UI, sidebar versus, the rest of my data, I can have this. Sometimes I won't put this up here up at top. I will take advantage of putting something else. Maybe it would actually be this URL, and I would put the URL right here up at the top, because this, as an indication of where am I for the whole of the layout, is actually enough. But within this context, you can see that I've done something. I've taken the opportunity to de-emphasize what is actually displayed here. I wanted to, and one of the things that I recognized is when I was using this file, because numbers were used for the count of examples, there were 45 examples, I was working with one specific example. And what's really interesting is people will remember things based on their ordinal position of where they fit in a sequence of things, or they will remember them based iconically or based on a name. Well, the name wasn't as important to me. What was important to me when I was using this solution, and this is something you should always think about your FileMaker solutions, and any UI design for that matter, is how might the user think about this? I was working with example 18. And so you can see here, as I scroll here, it's much easier for me to find 18 because the text of the title of what is actually being worked with is de-emphasized relative to the number. I wanted the number to stand out so that when I know I'm working with example 24, I can select 24, and now what becomes emphasized is the name itself. That's what becomes highlighted. This is what provides the variety in your UI. And all you have to do is follow that simple 3 rule. What are the 3 most important things about this layout, and then down into this object, this portal, this slider, this tab pane, etc. About the only thing you need to worry about is what's going to compete. If I am using this blue as my accent color for this whole UI, and I ask what are the top 3 of this whole panel? It can have multiple tabs, but I'm only ever looking at one tab at a time, whether I'm on this one or this one. What of the top 3 are important? Well, I'm not going to use this same accent of my primary accent blue within this area unless I need to draw attention. In other words, this button will not get the same treatment as this button, because this button gets the blue because it applies in terms of the rules of 3 to the whole of my layout, even though it also applies to the rules of 3 in this particular portal. So that's just something to think about when you're going to design your layout. So the last thing that I'm going to leave you with in this video is going to be the settings that I have on the object in this. We're just going to take a quick look at the calculation, which we already saw before, but we're going to look at the hide calculations on each of these items and how they're hidden and shown with regards to their display. Okay, let's go into the settings on the objects. First off, we will take a look at the gradient, and we will go to the fourth area, and we will look at this. We can see that quite clearly. Actually, we already showed that in the highlight. We've got the get active record number equals the get record number. We will see for the conditional formatting, we will see the exact same thing right there. Get active record number equals get record number. Now, one thing I will mention, and you have seen this in other videos of mine, one of the things that I like to do is I like to use custom functions. Whenever, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, if I notice that I start to repeat myself, and especially if it deals with any fields or context, that's when I many times want to move those things into conditional formatting. Now, would I move get active record number equals get record number? Let's go ahead and just do it into a custom function because I have now used it in 2 different places. Well, sometimes I might and sometimes I might not. It really depends on the solution. But regardless, that same calculation has to be evaluated now in 2 places. It is evaluated here and it is evaluated here. So the question becomes, does this add overhead to my solution if I put it in the context of a custom function? Let's go ahead and create one, and we'll call it active portal row. And we will just put that calculation in right there, and we'll say OK. So what this allows me to do is with this in 2 places, I could switch this, and I can now change this to active portal row, which I might not use that in general with regards to, and you can see what happened right there is I clicked and then I moved slightly, and that button bar just moved out of the containment of the portal. I have to do a quick undo in order to get that back in. And we're always worried about that. One of the ways that we can solve that, although it causes a problem, is when you're done, you can actually use the arrange and lock that object. So you can't actually do the accidental drag. The problem is when you lock an object in FileMaker, the lock does not just apply to the position, it also applies to making changes such as to the calculation. I wish they'd change that because it really doesn't make sense. The lock, for the most part, in my mind, just applies to the positioning of things. It doesn't necessarily apply to lock because I would have to be a developer in order to get into the actual settings. But if we go to our conditional formatting and change that to the zoomed on me, active portal row custom function, which matches the inside of a get function, we will see that we will have the exact same results on this, but I now could make modifications in that one place over in the custom function. But there's a thing to note that you have to do when you're going to do some of this tricky stuff. I don't know if you see this, but the fade that I have right here, I have to make that go away when I'm actually on a selected row. Now, the last thing that I'm going to leave you with is a trick that I did not do, but is something that you can use in order to consider your options of showing whatever is active and selected. Clearly, I chose to use conditional formatting. So in this case, I am applying the blue, I am applying the white. It's my primary accent, and it makes things stand out. What you can do is you can also take advantage within a portal of the active record state. Now, the states of objects, let's select that and drag this out just a little bit. You notice that one of the things that I also added here, as I'll zoom in a little bit, is I added a grid. And that grid, you're always going to want to divide things up based on your columns. And then within your columns, I use the smaller grid, or the minor portion, as FileMaker calls it, for the gap or the spacing between objects. Makes it really easy in order to follow things. So for example, this fits on the grid. There is no gap, but the object underneath it, so on. If you follow that grid, it gives your spacing of all of your objects really a really nice effect. So here, with an 8-point grid setting, I know that that's 8 points, but as I was stating, one of the other options in order to show whether something is or is not selected is you can also use the portals settings. When we select the portal and we go to the tab right here and we look at the portal itself, one of the options you have is the style for the row, and when you select the row, you have many options. For example, primary and alternate. These two really only apply when the portal itself has this checked right here, use alternate row state, which, by the way, a very interesting thing, this option right here, you will notice that this red triangle will change if you change either of these two. These are actually saved as part of the style when you're saving styles, and it's not something you would typically think is the case. But with this turned on, the primary and alternate would apply, but we also have this active row option right here, again, which applies to the one of the states. We can use that one. If we go to the active, one of the things that I have done, and if we take into account our grid or whatever we're doing, is I can turn on this line for a value of 8 pixels when active and set a completely different color. Let's say a red right here. Now I want to set this to none because I don't want the row to actually do anything. But at this point, what I've done is I've said on the row, when you are the active row, you're going to show a little indicator, and you're going to use that as part of the portal style rather than the objects that are in that. And we can see right there, we get this nice little effect right here. And I could do a default on this. I, of course, can get all of this white to be the color of this black so that I get this really nice blending. But in this case, you can see that I'm able to use a different type of indicator. If I wasn't using, say, for example, if this wasn't within my 3 rule and wasn't number 1, 2, or 3, and wasn't using my primary accent color, I could subdue this, wherein, let's say, the UI itself, the main portion of the UI, that information is more important than the actual navigation. In this case, navigating around was more important because we're learning from examples. That's when I would use a more subtle indicator that I can use, and that's just the style that's available on this particular portal. So these are just some of the changes that I made to this particular file, and I wanted to give you a rundown of how they were implemented, how they worked, and what's going on with regards to optimization, using those developer objects, and so forth. It is, as always, my hope, my great pleasure to bring you these videos. I hope you find a lot of value out of subscribing. I would like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.